Hello! Welcome to Free Will, Science, and Religion. I'm Chandler Klebs, and I'm here with George Ortega. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about since we don't have a free will and our choices are not up to us, then what is it up to? How do we describe how things happen? Because there might be many different ways that a person can describe how things happen. Because when someone believes in free will, they just think, oh, well, I'm the source of everything I do. Whereas this opens a discussion of, well, what is making me do what I do?
Exactly. Yep. And the problem, Chandler, is we're going to try to attempt to answer this, but ultimately we're not going to fully succeed because I think what we're going to rely on is causality. In other words, like this moment in the universe was completely caused by the previous, and the previous was caused by the one before that. And so we both know that ultimately we get back to the Big Bang, and although science stops at that point, logic tells us that causality isn't just a scientific concept. Causality means that, well, something created the Big Bang and something caused what created the Big Bang. So our problem, Chandler, in addressing this question of what is making what happen, our challenge is that ultimately this chain of cause and effect regresses back infinitely into the past, eternally into the past. So we never get to a point where actually, we can define or specify anything as being the origin or the creator of anything that happens thereafter.
Exactly, George. And this is what I often call the infinite regress. And a lot of people are lost on this point because this fries your brain because so many people's brains are just wired to think that there has to be a beginning of something. There has to be an ultimate beginning or origin. Um, but as we were talking about, like the Big Bang, if that's defined as the start of the universe, then well, like what came before that? What caused the Big Bang? So yeah, like you mentioned, we have an infinite regression problem where we never get to a truly satisfying answer that satisfies everyone. And I think some of us are more wired to where we will accept an infinite regress as being, the best explanation that we can come up with anyway. Whereas other people are more likely to suggest that there was a beginning at some point. And of course, I think there's problems with that too. But yeah, we can definitely open up this discussion and think, what does this all imply? What does this all mean? Because it seems that some of the biggest questions about existence and the nature of reality. This is sort of it's kind of a scientific investigation, but it's sort of like philosophical, what in the sense that it's something people talk about and will continue to be disagreed upon because there is no final blow that leads everyone to the same conclusion about this.
Right. And while I agree with you that I lean much more toward the infinite regress, that's not completely satisfying either in the sense that for example, our known universe is 13.7 billion years old. Well, what we're positing with an infinite universe and an infinite regress is for example, like a Google is what? One with 100 zeros. Well, multiply one Google by, a trillion Googles by another trillion. I mean, do you see that, by this infinite regress, like this whole span of 13.7 billion years, if we were going to, let's say, use the analogy of grains of sand, it would be like less than a single grain of sand in all the grains of sand in the entire Earth. That's how minute an amount of time, even the entire universe has been here. So all right, but what we want to explore, Chandler, though, is fine. We understand that poses certain problems, whatever. It almost kind of like transcends our ability to understand logically. But what we can understand logically is, the universe, beginning with the Big Bang, because we have these laws of nature. We had, in other words, like things do not just happen randomly or haphazardly. They happen according to various laws. And so like these laws, I think, can help us understand the nature of what is making us do what we do and what is making everything else, happen the way it does.
Yeah, and this is what's interesting, George, because one of the biggest misunderstandings is the idea of randomness. And even though we're determinists, I know some of our listeners are people who do believe that things happen for no reason at all. And the one thing I will have to say about that is that if things can happen for no reason at all, then that right there, the problem with that is that it ends the exploration. It just ends the discussion. It ends any further investigation because at bottom they're just assuming, oh, it happened for no reason, so I'm not going to investigate it. I'm not going to talk about it. And then that leads to prolonged ignorance about the causality that exists.
Right, Chandler. And yeah, I think rather than using the word reason, because, like, for example, reason maybe connotes kind of like psychological reasons or logical reasons. I think we might want to better use the word cause. Some people are saying that something happens without it having been caused. And, like, that's, to me, that's a patently absurd assertion, because that presupposes that before whatever happened, there was no universe. Because we understand that the universe and everything that happens within the universe evolves in a causal manner, state by state by state. So anybody who says that something is uncaused, they're claiming that the universe didn't exist before that something happened.
Exactly. That's why to say something that is uncaused is basically to I mean that has a burden of proof that cannot be met because you cannot prove that something has no cause, and yet we see endless examples of things being caused.
Yeah, and the only way to, I think you can, like, if we can quote unquote prove that the universe exists, at least that exists today, or consider it a priori evidence that requires no proof because it's so self-evident, then their whole argument evaporates. Because all we have to do is say, well, the universe existed before what you claim, happened uncaused, happened. And so, like, so we actually can prove causality, whereas, like, the existence of the universe prior to the event that they're saying is uncaused actually does not allow them to come near, even providing, a reasonable argument for something being uncaused.
Yeah, that's just it, is that for something to be uncaused, there has to be no matter at which can cause anything. There cannot be anything in existence.
Exactly. So and so, like, what does that mean? That basically that means that there would have to be no universe. Because what is a universe? It's matter and the forces that act on it. Exactly.
Yeah. And one of the things, George, is like one of the reasons I tend to ascribe, like some type of consciousness to smaller life forms than most people do. And part of the reason for that is because I guess for me it's more intuitive to think that there is, some type of intelligence at the cellular level of why things happen and why mutations happen, rather than assuming that things are truly random, that they're acausal. I can't go with that. So I view things in terms of causal evolution of life.
Well,
And
Chandler, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, but yeah, what I'm saying basically is that it makes more sense to assume that the tiniest of things that we know to exist are doing things perhaps intentionally, rather than to assume that they are completely uncaused, because the uncaused thing seems a lot less believable to me.
Yeah, I agree with you. And all right, so like, but let's progress to that in a step-by-step manner. So like, in other words, like first, though, like we acknowledge we're not even going to consider anymore even the prospect of something being uncaused because it's absurd. It's just like, completely absurd. So like we start out with everything being caused. Okay, now what we see in our world is this causality happens according to certain laws. It's like it's ordered. It's ordered by the laws of nature. It's ordered by the four fundamental forces, gravity, electromagnetism, the weak nuclear force, the strong nuclear force. And so, like, basically, there's this order that pervades the universe that kind of like that causality acts on. And so then, that's where we are. So, in other words, how do we describe this order? How do we describe this organization of the world? I mean, like some people would like to say, well, it's just ordered, and like we're not going to ask beyond that, right? But that's kind of like the libertarian saying, well, we just have free will, and we're not going to ask how we have it. We just have it. So what we're basically going for is a more precise, in-depth understanding of the nature of this order.
Yeah, because we clearly see that things are ordered around us and that there's systems of how things work. And I actually don't know what the weak and strong nuclear forces are either.
Well, nobody does. I mean, I mean, you read it in a physics book, and like it's like basically like at the nuclear level, there are forces that act on these atoms and particles that aren't gravity and they aren't electromagnetism. So it's a different kind of like energy. Who knows what it is? Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. But yeah, the fact that things work together in such a system, um, how all of the plants and the animals and the bacteria all interact. It's like it just there's so many questions there to ask about. Well, why is there gravity? Why are things this way and not another way?
Right.
And that's why I want people to have those discussions because it's interesting.
Right, and Chandler, so like just like with a single-celled organism, you know, a single-celled organism is actually no different than an organism as complex as a human being because neither of us have free will. What we do is not up to us, and what the single-celled organism does is not up to it. So then we're left with you know something, is making them do what they do and us do what we do. So, all right, so it has this order. Now, I think what I'm going to argue for next is like, it's leading up to the point that you were making about like just, basically like ascribing consciousness to these single-celled organisms, perhaps even to particles, is like there seems to have to be a general overall consciousness, a directing. In other words, like I don't think that the universe is just making things happen. Because again, when we're defining consciousness, or basically consciousness is defined as awareness. So it's very difficult. It's impossible actually for me to conceive of a universe making things happen, making everything happen, and not being aware that it's making everything happen.
Yeah, I get what you're saying there because it seems, I mean, I don't think you can get the type of order we see from from unintentionalness, if that makes sense.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, this is really powerful stuff because I think I don't know. I think this has a lot to do with why in the U.S. the creationism and evolution debate has been so fierce is because there there seems to be conflicts and confusing terms used because I think it's difficult because people are often trying to make the universe unconscious in a sense. They're trying to make the evolution, the biological evolution, they're trying to make it all unconscious, and then somehow humans are conscious and no other animal or plant is. And I'm not sure how a lot of people have come to that reasoning because it makes no sense.
Right. And Chandler, I think what their premises are, I think many of these people are like, traditional atheists or the militant atheists like Dawkins and all that I mean, they understandably have a lot to protest against in terms of like the evil that has come about in terms, through religion. The Crusades, the Inquisition and all. There's some horrible, horrible things that religion has done. So like, but what happens is that like, any mention of a conscious universe to them seems too close to kind of like the acknowledgement that, oh my God, well, what we're describing in naturalistic terms is what these theists are describing in religious terms as God. So I think, that's what's preventing them from understanding the nature of this naturalistic reality we live in, because the more we investigate it, the more we see it has certain things in common with our religious conceptions of reality.
Yeah, that's what's interesting about it is I think that people are emotionally reacting to certain descriptions. Um, when we talk about consciousness of the universe, and I guess it gets a little spooky because when people talk about you know intention among even single-celled organisms, a lot of people get a little spooked out because we're so used to thinking like people are used to thinking of consciousness only on a human level. And then I guess people get a little bit fearful when they start thinking about the implications of what we do know about the order and how things work.
Right now, Chandler, with regard to intention, just like we human beings, actually, like a puppet never intends anything, right? A computer never intends anything. I mean, colloquially, we human beings may intend things, but that's just like a matter of speaking. Because we don't have a free will, we're actually not intending anything. We're actually manifesting the intention of the Big Bang, but even that creates a problem because if we're positing an infinite regress where we never reach a point of a beginning of everything, then in a certain sense, you know there is no original intent. We never get to a point where we can say, yes, this is like, at a certain point the universe intended for something to happen, because there's always a point, there's always like an infinite regress of causality before that intention, that quote unquote intention.
Yeah, and see, when we talk about intention, I mean, it's always tied in with the idea of desire. When we say that somebody, well, see, when we say that somebody did something intentionally, that means there was a certain outcome they wanted and acted to achieve that outcome. But then you realize, well, these humans are made up of very smaller cells, smaller organisms, a lot of which are bacteria. And then you have to think, well, how does this intention map down at all the tiniest level of all this matter somehow combined?
Exactly. So I think when we're describing intention, we have to actually use what we use when describing responsibility. We humans are pragmatically responsible, morally responsible, but we're not fundamentally morally responsible, right? So, like, a single celled organism might have intention in, for example, moving toward light or toward heat or toward coolness, but it's not fundamental intentionality, right? Because there's a chain of causality that regresses, before that single celled organism was actually created. That's actually, responsible for making it intend.
Exactly. There's always a cause behind the intention. There always has to be some reason, and it seems that for everything that we see, it seems to be a pleasure pain thing. It seems to be, we it's beyond explanation, but it causes something pleasure to do one thing, while it might cause pain or nothing at all to do something else. And so it seems that this intention seems to be tied up with the hedonic imperative.
Yeah, and like so like and even that, is not like, basically we are hardwired, we are determined or caused to seek pleasure and avoid pain in the ways we do. It's not even our, seeking pleasure and avoid it. It's like our being made to seek pleasure and avoid pain. But let's progress beyond, because like we've gotten to the point where we understand that, that the universe has to be conscious, because the universe can't, basically make things happen without being aware of the things it makes happen. And now, so here, now let's deal with this issue of intelligence, because I think, all right, intelligence, I think, is something that we ascribe to the behavior of organisms. In other words, like if we're going to like create a machine, it's like, the complexity of this invention and what goes into it that we define as intelligent. And like if we're just going to, like, for example, like add one plus one, then that's a lower level of intelligence. But like I think what we have to acknowledge is that because we human beings do not have a free will, the most advanced intelligence that we have that creates these, like, the hadron collider. I mean, I'm not actually sure what's the most sophisticated scientific discovery we have, but whatever it is, it's not our intelligence, because the causal chain behind that discovery regresses back to even before the Big Bang. So like how would you relate that to intelligence? What would that tell you in terms of like, the nature of the universe?
Well, I would compare it to artificial intelligence in the sense that a computer chess program, for example, has been programmed to make the best possible moves according to the setup of the board, and that's why they can almost always beat humans who supposedly have real intelligence but really can't outperform computers. So here's the thing is, like, I think it's a little bit tricky when talking about intelligence, because intelligence to me tends to mean, it tends to mean doing the thing that makes sense according to some goal. So, in chess, it's about, winning the game, what move will achieve that. Or in most of our lives, it's about happiness. Well, what will make us happy? What's the intelligent way, the efficient way to achieve that? So, what happens is intelligence always goes back to desire, which always goes back to pleasure.
Right. And also, like, when you brought up the term artificial intelligence, I think that that's a key to our understanding this, because you're right. Apparently, like, so it's not like we're not, creating the need for pleasure and avoidance of pain. We're programmed for this. But in terms of, like, for example, we define a computer as having artificial intelligence, right? Now, here's the thing: we human beings, our intelligence is just as artificial as is the computer's, because just as the computer's intelligence is not really the computer's, it's whoever programmed it and all, and whoever created it. Our intelligence isn't ours, it's whatever programmed and created us.
Exactly. See, I think that there really isn't a distinction between artificial versus real intelligence, because when you think about it, we're computers that are programmed in a different way. Just as now computers are, are built by humans, the hardware, and programmed through software. And but what happens with us is that, well, we didn't create ourselves any more than the computer did. Our parents are the proximate cause of that. And so by our genetics and all our conditioning, every experience, everything we're taught, we end up programmed in a certain way. We have these desires where we are automatically inclined to do one thing more than another.
Exactly. So, like, basically, so far, what we've determined is that because we don't have a free will, and this is again the importance of understanding the, um, how important it is to get this right. This free will issue is not just practical; it's also very very key in terms of understanding the fundamental nature of reality. So from our understanding that we don't have a free will, we come to the understanding that the universe is conscious and the universe is intelligent. And now we get to this holy grail of all questions, the one that what you've been raising about pleasure and pain. Because, apparently the universe, has programmed us to seek pleasure, avoid pain, respond to reward and punishment. And that is like the most essential feature of our reality. So, how do we describe that?
Yeah, that's the tricky one, George, because this is basically the top of it all. Like it always goes back to pleasure and pain. And so, we refer to this as the hedonic imperative, where whatever, yeah, we see people acting this way all the time, where they keep doing something because it makes them happy, or they avoid doing something because it makes them sad. But I think it's difficult for us to describe why something causes us pleasure or pain because it's like information that we don't actually have access to.
Exactly. Now let's explore actually as far as we know, the origin of pleasure and pain. I mean, I did some research into this recently, and it's hypothesized that the first organisms with a neurology sophisticated enough to be able to experience pleasure and pain came about 300 million years ago. They're basically seen as the decapods, these marine creatures that have 10 legs, which include crabs and lobsters. So so now the key thing about this, think about this, because sometimes we ask ourselves, why is there evil in the world, right? Why should there be evil? Why can't everything be completely blissful, whatever? So now, if we understand that, without pain or pleasure, without pain, there could be no evil. Because, really, by definition, I think by logical definition, um, evil is what creates pain. Because, if no pain was created, how could we, claim that anything is evil? So what we come up with is that, before 300 million years ago, at least, on this planet, who knows what happened, to because there's got to be like an infinite number almost of like other civilizations throughout the universe. I mean, how could there not be? But at least on Earth, evil and goodness and pain and pleasure are only 300 million years old. Before that, at least again, according to our best scientific knowledge to date, there was no pleasure and pain.
Yeah, that's a freaky thing to think about. And I mean, somebody might almost argue that it was better back then before pain was possible.
Right. And so so here's the thing. So um all right, when we're kind of like playing with action figures, these action figures really don't do anything. We are kind of like imparting to them their their actions and stuff. It's really about us. So so the universe actually uses human beings and other organisms in that same way to kind of like manifest its will, or whatever we want to, however we want to describe, it's, quote unquote intentionality. So then the question becomes, fine, at least in terms of organisms, like human beings and decapods, there was no pleasure and pain before 300 million years ago. But I mean, then the next question becomes, does this conscious intelligence that preceded it, and that presumably goes back infinitely into this regress, you know, can we describe it as possessing pleasure and pain? Because then the question becomes, if it doesn't, and if it didn't, then how did suddenly pain and pleasure arise? I mean, maybe we can speculate that it has to have a certain kind of neurological sophistication, but maybe not. Maybe pain and pleasure are actually aspects of reality of the universe that don't require an organic mechanism.
Well, what comes down to is, anything that we see now, anything that exists now, like pleasure or pain or intelligence or whatever, well, since we have this infinite regress, basically, then there has to be a cause for that. So it's kind of difficult to ever find a point at which there would be no pleasure and pain and then suddenly there is, because then you would have that would be like adding something that didn't exist and making it pop out of nowhere.
Yeah, let's explore that and present that in a bit more detail. If I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that, like, before these decapods were able to experience pain and pleasure, there had to be the kind of like conception of pain and pleasure. In other words, the universe, the conscious, intelligent universe, had to be aware of these, qualities or experiences of pain and pleasure before they could like cause these organisms to develop the capacity to feel that way.
Exactly. See, that's what's interesting, George, is that now I'm certainly no expert in the how nerves and the biological functioning of how signals of pleasure and pain are sent throughout the body. But here's the deal: if you think about it, that we're all a bunch of atoms. We're a collection of these tiniest things. Well, then, if a group of atoms is experiencing some pleasure or pain, well, then how does that work unless those atoms themselves are feeling something?
Absolutely. All right. So now with that, you're dealing with the specific. Let's move now to the general. So basically, what we were just saying through just like, what you presented, that basically the concept of pleasure and pain had to exist before its manifestation in organisms was evolved. Then the question that we're left with now is that so we have a conscious, intelligent universe that, you know, I don't know if it's capable of feeling pleasure and pain, but certainly, pleasure and pain have to be a part of it. And the question that comes to my mind is the question, this has a lot to do with theology, with God and all, is like, why would the universe, because you have to understand the universe is everything. So like when it creates pain, the universe is actually afflicting itself. It's creating pain within itself because, like, the organisms that experience pain are not outside of the universe. So then the question becomes, why would the universe evolve something that is inherent, or that feels painful? What is the logic behind that?
Yeah, that's a really good one because one could often compare it just like we could compare it to things that humans do that cause themselves pain. And so what's causing them to cause themselves pain by doing things that they end up regretting later?
Right, because you think, like, you would think that, like, for example, if a human being was profoundly intelligent, I think we would like choose, quote unquote choose, to not experience any pain at all. So that the universe that evolved us, that, through its causality led to us and our intelligence, being, how many times more intelligent than we are, you would think that it would like not choose to even conceive of pain. So, and again, because like in terms of questions, that we're sentient beings, we human beings, and that's our defining characteristic. Our most fundamental experience of reality is in relation to pleasure and pain, because that's, everything else is details. So, like, you know, from our perspective, the fundamental question, and again, it's been asked in religion, it's not, just a naturalistic question. Why is there pain? Why is there pain? Why would the universe evolve pain? Why would the universe conceive of pain? It doesn't make sense. It's kind of like almost as unanswerable as the infinite regress.
Yeah, and see, here's what it comes down to is that to me, it suggests that there's some kind of struggle, there's some sort of conflict, just as each of us as humans, and I imagine this would apply to almost every life form out there, is we have conflicts of desires. We want to do this, but we also want to do this, which can't be done at the same time as that. And so, because there's different things that cause us pleasure and different things that cause us pain, I think what happens is that we end up going into a mathematical mode of pros and cons, weighing up the pleasure and pain of different quote unquote possibilities. And sometimes we get the answer wrong.
Oh yeah, I mean, not just sometimes. I mean, my main field for years was happiness, and what they found is human beings are terrible at predicting what's going to create greater happiness. I mean, like we go after like more money and more academic degrees and these things that just don't create lasting happiness. So I know we get this wrong a lot. Now, here's something else to consider. We as human beings are hardwired to seek pleasure and avoid pain. And it would seem that moment by moment, day by day, month by month, year by year, ultimately millennium by millennium, we have to be, I would think we have to be getting better at seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. We no longer have slavery. We no longer mistreat women as much as we did before. We've eliminated child labor. We're kind of like, many years ago, almost everybody on the planet was poor. Now, many of us are like, even the poor among us are actually living better lives than the kings did, in the 1400s. So, like, we're evolving, from more pain, it seems, to less pain. And so it would seem that, at a certain point, whether it's like a thousand or 500,000 or a million years into the future, that at least we human beings could theoretically exist without experiencing any pain at all. And then, then we could actually just then, translate or ascribe this same progress to the universe. I mean, like if we're hardwired to seek pleasure and avoid pain, and we're always moving toward pleasure and away from pain, then I mean, I actually have to ask this: is this something that we can also ascribe to the universe in general? This intelligent consciousness?
Well, it sounds like what you're saying is that the universe will eventually evolve in such a way that it learns how to avoid pain better.
Yes, yes. In other words, like so, like it's as if like these okay, yeah. It's interesting you bring up the dual motivations and all because that probably plays a part in this. Like so, maybe it kind of like its intention, quote unquote, was to create pleasure, but the only way it could do it at the time of the decapods was to also create pain. And now the work of at least this part of the universe where Earth and organisms is to kind of like find a way to retain the pleasure and eliminate the pain.
Yeah, cause isn't that kind of the struggle that we're doing all the time? I mean, I know in the human world that's what people are doing. For example, they're trying to get the good without the bad. There's things we want to do, but then sometimes they cause pain later. So take for example, like people do get pleasure out of say alcohol or recreational drugs temporarily. For example, that I think that's a good example. And so people become addicted to certain drugs because of the pleasure that that causes them. But then sometimes that also has things that cause them pain later on. And what's tricky is that everyone's in this struggle of how to get the pleasure and avoid the pain.
Oh yeah, and you're right. And that is the most fundamental. We're always doing that moment to moment. That's what our entire lives are about. Um, all right. So now, while you were saying that, another kind of like a question came to mind, and this has to do with experience. In other words, like, um, in terms of understanding the nature of reality, that we're a part of, because we're not separate from whatever controls us. We're part of it. Just like our hand is part of, you know, this, like our hand is controlled by our brain, but it's part of this like human organism. So, I mean, a question that comes to mind, and I mean, so you've got, we concluded the universe is conscious, the universe is intelligent. Now, a question that comes to mind, and this has to do with the infinite regress and just like the concept of eternity, is like, what do you think it must be like for this like universal consciousness? If it has kind of like, just like we have a brain, if like this universe, this reality that we live in has one unified consciousness, what do you think it must be like to just like, have always existed, always existing, and especially just like as one? In other words, like this consciousness cannot be two. It's like, for example, you're a human being, I'm a human being, we interact with other human beings, and so we have this kind of camaraderie, whatever. But like with the one singular universe, I mean, I would hope it wouldn't require that kind of like, I hope it's, there's more pleasure in unity than in relationship. But the question becomes, yeah, what do you think it's like for this universal, eternal, intelligent consciousness?
That's hard to imagine because I mean, like each of us have only, like as the consciousness that we are, have only been around for such a short time, you know. And like, I've been around for 28 years and yet I hardly remember anything of my life. I mean, I have certain memories, but most of the things that we've experienced we forget. And so I wonder if this universal consciousness that we're talking about would be the same way, that it wouldn't remember everything.
It's a good question. What it All right, but let me just address one thing before that, because it relates to it. Like, for example, right now we're doing a podcast and we might be spending an hour and a half, whatever. And then after that, we'll go on to something else. After that, we'll go on to something else. And we all do this. We go from activity to activity to activity. That is what fills our days. Now, for example, let's imagine this podcast, this last, especially this last one, which we're at, let's see how, we're at about 30, 42 minutes. Let's imagine this podcast, these 42 minutes represents, the 13.7 billion year history of our universe, of, since the Big Bang, right? So like this consciousness, this universe, it seems to be going like creating worlds. It creates like, just like we created this podcast, this universal consciousness created this known universe, and then it'll create another one, and not just that, it's got like universes all over. But all right, present the thought. So you raised the question that would this consciousness have a memory of the past? Like, would it, remember what happened before the Big Bang? So how would you answer that?
Well, I'm not sure that memory would be possible because it seems to me like I know with us that our memories are stored in our brains somehow. Um, and it seems it would be difficult if there was a time, when the universe, if it was any slightly more disordered than we see now, would there have been a recording device, a device to record, to write it down, to magnetically store it like a hard drive somehow? Like how would a memory storage and retrieval system even work?
Well, I mean, if we're asking that question, we could also ask the question of like, how could the universe be conscious without a brain, or how could the universe be intelligent without neurons? So we kind of have to posit that there's kind of like you know, that this organic brain, and again, because we don't have a free will, we are actually, we're manifesting the intelligence of the universe. So what I would, and actually another question that this raises is like, fine, okay, the universe is conscious, the universe is intelligent. Now I think we're asking, is the universe knowledgeable? Because because then the question will become, does it know the future? Does it remember the past? It seems to certainly be aware of the present. Um, I'm not, I think all right, because like now consider time, consider like the past, the present, and the future. I think while in our individual human lives, we see the past is no longer there and the future not having happened yet, I'm not sure that's the same thing for the universe. I mean, like sometimes you hear people say that that actually past, present, and future don't exist. There's just like a now. And I mean, I can't accept that in terms of human beings. Like to us, relative to us, I think the past and future certainly exist. But like in terms of knowledge, to this intelligent, conscious universe, it's conceivable that part of this of its awareness, part of its consciousness is that it would like be able to be aware of itself, not just how it was in the past, but how it will be in the future, in addition to how it is in the present. Again, this is something that I'm kind of like asserting. I'm not sure I have a sufficient enough argument for it, but I guess the reason I would lean more toward it is because like we human beings, for example, can predict exactly where the sun is going to be, 100 years from now, in the sky and all. So I think if we have like pretty amazing predictive powers, you would think that an intelligent consciousness, vastly more intelligent than ours, would have similar kinds of like predictive and memorizing capabilities.
And once again, what's bizarre about it is that since, well, the universe is everything that exists, that includes us, so anything we do, the universe is doing. So I guess we can't say that we have any more or less intelligence or memory or pleasure or pain than the universe because we are the universe. So it really blows your mind.
Yeah, and that's an interesting question because, like, for example, um, you know, we are just like a teeny part of the universe, right? So now it could be that there's pain on this planet Earth, but it could be like in 100 billion, um, civilizations around us, and in 100 billion galaxies around us. It could be there's no pain, or there could be like far more intelligence. We can't really know the nature of the expansive universe based on this like specific. It's kind of like being at one place on the earth, and from that perspective saying that we can we can understand or see what it's like everywhere on the earth, right? We have a very limited perspective.
Yeah, here's a thought, George. People don't understand the massive smallness.
Hmm.
Okay, here's what I'm going at is okay, now us humans from the our viewpoint, we look at an ant and it looks, oh, it's just tiny. It's just this tiny thing. But look how small we look in comparison to the whole planet. Look how small the planet looks in comparison to the whole galaxy. Or I mean, just look at how infinitely small each of us are. And then all of a sudden you start to realize that at first you were thinking that the ant and the grasshopper and all these tiny things were way small and you were way big, but no, they're not much smaller than you.
Oh, Chandler. Yeah, I mean, now, all right, now we're dealing with the kind of like the very, essence of reality, in terms of smallness, relative size, and all. Now, here's because as long as we're discussing the fundamental nature of reality, there's four infinities that we're aware of. Most of us are only aware of three of them. To most of us, this fourth one hasn't really come to their mind. So, like, for example, the first one is that it seems, at least logically, that the universe, beyond this Big Bang, known universe that we have, extends infinitely, in every direction. spatially there's an infinity that goes out and out, and again, logic says like, how could it stop someplace? Just like, and so like, all right, so we have this infinite outness, right? Now, in terms of time, we have this, infinite regress into the past, that we can go back into the past and never like reach a point where everything began, because logic, would then, kind of like inform us, well, wait a minute, there must have been something before that. All right, so that's the second infinity. The third infinity is that like we can posit that this universe, this reality will always continue to exist, because how could it not? How could, what would replace it? I mean, whatever. We can't conceive of that. All right, now we come to the fourth infinity. And before I presented, there is like, according to our science, energy kind of like acts in certain quanta. There's a quanta of energy. This is like where the term quantum physics came from. And it has something to do with Planck's constant, that I think says that like, there's a limit to the size of a particle, the size of like a, kind of like a unit of energy. Okay, and so like, so basically like, that seems to be a limit imposed on kind of like the movement of energy that we know of. But now, all right, apply the same logic we apply to the past and the future, and to the infinite space going outward to our micro world. And Chandler, we have to conclude that within, for example, every particle of our universe, we can theoretically, logically continue to get smaller and smaller and smaller, and never stop getting smaller. So, what we ultimately arrive at is like, we have an infinite number of infinitely regressing minute universes. I mean,
Whoa. Well, yeah, I get what you're saying because no one can point to something and say, this is the biggest thing and then this is the smallest thing because there's always something bigger and there's always something smaller. We're dealing with infinity here. And I don't think that most humans are capable of thinking this way, at least yet. Maybe more people will become in tune to this in the future, but this idea of infinity, that's something that just never ends. It keeps going and going.
and again, the thing is like, people are pretty, these first three infinities are very common, right? How often do you hear about this fourth infinity? So I think what you and I might want to do, like maybe for an impersonal opinions podcast, I think like Trick and Mitch and Mike and these guys would be interested in exploring this concept, and exploring it, relative to our known physics.
Yeah, and also, I know that Michael Wall still wants to do the theories of time thing, which kind of sounds a little related.
You're right. We can actually weave that into it. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I'm mind blown. But yeah, I mean, seriously, I mean, and I'm sure some of our listeners are lost just as I am because we've been talking about so much. But I mean, to a certain extent, we have to say there are no truly satisfying answers to some of these questions we've been asking about pleasure and pain and these infinities and weird stuff. But isn't it interesting to talk about it?
Absolutely, because like you're right. There, like with the infinite regress, with certain things, like there, it's not completely satisfactory. But who's to say that we couldn't ultimately come up with a, completely satisfactory answer? I mean, like, this might be a stage along the development of that, possible answer. I mean, so again, some things, seem, beyond, the grasp of logic. They may not necessarily be.
Well, just think about it, George. Just a few decades ago, who could have predicted that we would be recording this podcast talking about this stuff? Nobody can predict that stuff. And so, if there's anything I've learned is that the more I know that I don't know. You know,
Oh yeah. God, yeah. Just look around. Anybody who looks around in the room, at the computer, at a floor, at fabrics, at all this stuff. this world is like, nobody understands this. I mean, like, some scientists understand maybe polymers that go into plastics and all this stuff, but we're living in a world that pretty much nobody understands any of it, on a day-to-day level.
Well, yeah, and you have to think now. There's the practical level. There's what we need to do to function in this society, and most of us know how to do that pretty well. We know that there's a way we function around other people. We know how to make things happen. I mean, we know how to flush the toilet by flipping a knob, even though we don't know how all the details of how the toilet works and how the plumbing works. So most of us, just like most of us, know how to use computers, but we don't know how to build them.
Yeah, and actually, our challenge for this point in the evolution of civilization is that our technology has exceeded our wisdom and our understanding of our world. So, in other words, like, this climate change thing, if had we known back in the 1850s what we were doing, or even back in the 1970s, I think we might have, like, made different decisions. But we have this means of burning oil and of manufacturing all this stuff without sufficient realization, understanding of the consequences. Like, so I think, yeah, and in terms of like the fundamental major challenge of our planet today is to shift our focus away from the material, because like for most of us, we have even much more than we need. I mean, think about it, you know, shifting from the material to the development of our, us as individuals and us as a global society, in a way that we act much more responsibly, much more wisely, to ensure not just the happiness of this generation, but the happiness and actually existence of the generations to come.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of optimistic after what you said, about just look how much less pain that we're able to cause as opposed to the way things used to be. There's a lot of harm still going on in the world, but some people are waking up and realizing, like you mentioned, like people are realizing slavery is wrong. People are becoming more aware of how racism and sexism and even speciesism, people are now challenging these ancient things that have been going on. So I do think we can say that the future will have less pain than it did in the past.
I think I tend to agree with it. It's kind of like our human race is going through like an adolescence, when we were like 16, 17, 18, those can be really difficult years, we're trying to figure stuff out. And so like, but yes, eventually we figure things out. And I agree with you because, as you said, because we're hardwired to seek pleasure and avoid pain, and because the historical trend for millennia has been, to improve the quality of life in our civilization. I think that, even though it's going to take, a few kinds of quote unquote miracles for our civilization to, to respond to climate change and all, and to ultimately move on, I agree with you. I'm optimistic. I think that, like, when the time comes that we actually have to do things, I guess I'm confident. I'm optimistic that it won't be too late. That we will be able to kind of like do what needs to be done.
Yeah, I mean, it's like it's going to take a bunch of ordinary miracles, miracles that happen all the time, as people are naturally finding ways to seek pleasure and avoid pain. I
Yep.
think it can happen. I think we're moving towards. I think people have already generally been moving towards a more compassionate treatment of others anyway, but I think it will be accelerated by this understanding that nobody has a free will and that nobody deserves to suffer.
Absolutely. Chandler, we're like 59 and 10 seconds. So maybe we should end this for like, for an hour.
Yeah, sounds great. Okay, you've been listening to Free Will Science to Religion with Chandler Klebs and George Ortega, and this episode probably blew your mind just as it did mine. We've talked about many different topics, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to this as much as we've enjoyed talking about it. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.